They told you she was your healing. But what if she was just rehearsing how to break you gently? Have you ever loved someone so deeply, only to realize later you were never really seen, you thought it was love? But what if it was just emotional camouflage? Maybe you're not heartbroken. Maybe you're just waking up. And it hurts, because the fantasy felt safer than the truth. You kept chasing the version of her that saved you from yourself, the version that made you feel like you mattered, like you were finally enough. But what if she was never that person? What if she was just reflecting back the parts of you you couldn't face? This isn't about blame. This isn't about hate. This is about looking at the mirror when it stops showing you what you want and starts showing you what's real. Because there's a reason this hit you hard. A reason you're still here listening. And maybe, just maybe, that reason has nothing to do with her and everything to do with who you've been trying not to become. Ethan met her on a Tuesday afternoon. Not under fireworks or fate, but in the quiet of a bookstore cafe. She smiled like sunlight cracking through closed blinds, soft, unassuming, but it warmed something he didn't know was cold. He thought it was connection. He thought it was real. But now he wonders, was it ever about her, or was it always about the way she made him feel? She laughed at his jokes, asked questions that made him feel seen, touched his arm in that just right, almost accidental way. He told himself, this is different. He believed she understood him before he even spoke, that she saw through the layers, that she chose him. But it wasn't long before Ethan began to disappear. At first, it was subtle. He stopped talking about the band he liked because she once scoffed at the genre. He laughed a little less loudly, smiled a little more politely, reached for her approval like a child trying not to upset his mother. And every time she pulled back, even slightly, it was like gravity stopped working. He didn't understand it then. But now he knows. He wasn't falling in love with her. He was falling in love with the mirror she held. It wasn't her presence that made him feel safe. It was the feeling she gave him, the rush of being enough, the relief of being wanted. And that feeling was intoxicating. But here's the haunting part. That version of her, the one he held onto, may have never existed, not because she lied, but because he was only ever seeing what he needed. And she was just skilled enough to give it to him without trying too hard. She wasn't a villain. She didn't trap him. He built the trap himself and called it love. Because Ethan, like many men, didn't just crave affection, he craved redemption. He thought if someone could love him completely, maybe he could stop feeling incomplete. But what happens when the mirror breaks? What happens when she stops reflecting your worth? You don't just feel rejected, you feel erased. He would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments that once felt magical, her glance across the table, her voice saying, "I believe in you." Her silence now louder than her words ever were. And it's in that silence where truth begins to whisper. She didn't disappear, she didn't change, he just woke up. Because the woman he loved might have never existed. Every boy hears a story, long before he understands what love even means. It comes in fairy tales, in bedtime whispers, in cartoons where the prince saves the princess, and the reward is always her love. It's subtle but powerful. They don't say it out loud, but the message is clear. If you're strong, if you're brave, if you give enough, prove enough, suffer enough, she will love you. And that love, that's supposed to be the moment your life begins. Ethan grew up like many boys, watching heroes fight for women who were beautiful, soft, pure. The kind of women whose love looked like salvation. They didn't need to earn it, they were the prize. He remembers sitting on his bedroom floor, watching a movie where the hero wins the girl after risking his life, his little heart pounding with hope that one day someone would look at him like that, like he was enough, like he was chosen. But no one told him this story had a catch, that behind every romantic rescue was a silent exchange. You prove yourself worthy, and she decides if you deserve love. So he started early, trying to be the right kind of boy, helpful, kind, agreeable. He learned that if he was too angry, too loud, too selfish, he would be less lovable, so he trimmed pieces of himself, rounded the edges, swallowed the rage. And every time someone rewarded his sacrifice with affection, it confirmed the lie. Love wasn't a gift, it was a transaction, and he was the seller. By the time Ethan reached high school, he'd already been trained not to ask, "What do I want?" but what would make her stay. He became excellent at reading rooms, at shifting his tone, at becoming whatever version of himself made her feel safe enough to love him. And when he met her, that woman in the cafe, he stepped into the role effortlessly. He was Ethan. He was who he thought Ethan had to be to finally deserve love. And it worked for a while. But the thing about playing a role is, eventually, the curtain falls. And when it does, what's left? A man who doesn't know the sound of his own voice, a man who's lived inside someone else's love story for so long he forgot how to write his own. If you've ever felt like that, if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered who's staring back, you're not alone, and you're not broken, but you have been lied to, and the worst part, you believed it, just like Ethan did. But what came next was the moment the story began to crack. It started with small silences. The kind you don't notice at first, like when she didn't text back until morning, and he convinced himself she must have been tired. Or when she said, "You're too much sometimes," and he laughed it off, pretending it didn't sting. Ethan didn't push back. He adjusted. He made himself smaller so she'd stay. He stopped bringing up his dreams of starting his own studio because she said stability is more attractive. He cut off late-night calls with friends when she said she liked him being more present. He changed the way he dressed, stopped wearing the cologne he loved, deleted songs that reminded him of his ex, because she once raised an eyebrow at the lyrics. It wasn't control, it wasn't force. It was devotion, he told himself. Love requires sacrifice, right? So he kept sacrificing, piece by piece, layer by layer. Until one day he was walking past a mirror in a hotel lobby, and he didn't recognize the man staring back, not because he looked different, but because he felt hollow. He smiled on cue, made her coffee just right, gave her compliments she never returned. And the more he gave, the more she expected. Her affection became currency, a nod of approval here, a lukewarm smile there, never enough to feel full, just enough to stay addicted. Ethan thought he was loving deeply. But what he was really doing was begging quietly, begging to matter, begging to be seen, begging to be enough. And it hurt in a way he couldn't explain, because she hadn't hit him, she hadn't screamed, she hadn't cheated, she had simply watched him fade and let him, you see, sometimes the sharpest knife isn't a betrayal, it's indifference. And Ethan began to realize he wasn't in a relationship, he was in a performance. And the role he played, the good man, the giving man, the pleasing man, was eating him alive. Have you ever felt that? Like you're showing up every day in a love that quietly demands you disappear. He thought, if I just give a little more, she'll love me like I love her. But love, real love, doesn't ask you to disappear. It invites you to exist fully. And as Ethan stood in that mirror-lit hallway, with a forced smile and dimmed eyes, he asked himself a question he hadn't dared to speak before. What if this isn't love? And the silence that followed was louder than any goodbye. The day she left, she didn't slam a door, she didn't cry, she didn't even explain, she just said, "I think we've grown apart," and walked out of the apartment they once called ours. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by things she didn't take: a half-used candle, a jacket she never liked but he kept because she once wore it, and smiled. It wasn't the loss that broke him, it was the echo. Because in the silence she left behind, something shattered, and it wasn't his heart, it was the illusion. He didn't feel like a man who had been abandoned. He felt like a ghost who had never really existed, not to her, not even to himself. He walked around the apartment for hours, opening drawers, replaying conversations. He read old texts, hoping to find the moment where it all went wrong. But no moment ever came, just a slow vanishing, not of her, of him. He remembered a time when he would laugh freely, write music until sunrise, dream out loud. But those pieces had gone quiet, one by one, in exchange for her smile. He didn't lose a partner, he lost his reflection. The version of himself that only felt real when she was near. It hit him hardest one morning, 2 weeks later. He looked in the mirror while brushing his teeth, and for the first time, he didn't cry, he didn't rage, he just stared and whispered, "I don't know who I am without her." That was the truth he'd been running from. He wasn't mourning her love. He was mourning his identity, an identity built around her gaze. Have you ever done that? Built your sense of worth on someone else's approval. Because when they stop seeing you, you don't just feel rejection, you feel annihilation. It's not heartbreak, it's erasure. And Ethan began to understand something most people avoid their whole lives. Love built on dependency isn't love, it's survival. And when the source of that survival leaves, so does your oxygen. But here's the quiet truth. The version of him that crumbled when she walked away wasn't really him. It was a mask, one designed to be accepted, to be loved, to be needed. And now that the mask was gone, he could finally begin to breathe, not deeply, not easily, but honestly. If you've ever felt like the person you were died when someone left, you're not crazy, you're not weak. You were just wearing a costume for too long. And now, your skin is remembering what it feels like to be your own. Ethan used to describe her as soft, not just her voice, but her presence. The way she smiled with restraint, how she tilted her head when he spoke, the way she touched his wrist gently when he was spiraling, it felt like peace. But now in hindsight, that softness feels different. It feels rehearsed, not fake, not malicious, but intentional, like something she learned, not something she was. And that unsettled him more than anything, because if her gentleness wasn't natural, then what else was? He started noticing things, small things, that felt more like calculations than compassion. The way she praised him after he did something self-sacrificing. How she gave affection only after he apologized. How she pulled away whenever he showed strength she didn't control. Her warmth had always felt like shelter. Now, it felt like strategy, not because she wanted to harm him, but because she had learned, maybe from childhood, maybe from heartbreak, that softness keeps people close, especially men like Ethan, men who crave safety, men who confuse kindness with connection, men who need approval like water. She gave just enough to keep him thirsty, just enough to keep him reaching. And the more he reached, the more she shaped herself to fit his hunger. Ethan realized that she was never who he thought she was. She was who he needed her to be. She mirrored his needs, reflected his longings, responded to his pain. But that mirror was never real. She never asked him to open up. He offered it. He poured himself into her because she felt like stillness in a chaotic world. But now he sees she wasn't still. She was studying, learning his rhythms, watching his reactions, understanding which parts of herself to amplify and which ones to hide. Not because she was evil, but because that's what survival had taught her. Be soft enough to be loved, but never soft enough to be powerless. And Ethan, he mistook her adaptability for authenticity. That was his blind spot. He wanted so badly for her to be real that he ignored the signs, the missing eye contact, the carefully chosen words. The moment she comforted him, not with presence but with control. It wasn't always conscious. She wasn't playing a game. But her softness wasn't surrender. It was armor, painted in pastel. And now, sitting alone in the silence she left behind, Ethan can finally say what he never could before. She wasn't cruel, she was just surviving. But he was the one who handed over his power wrapped in the ribbon of her calm. And that realization, it stung more than any goodbye. Because the softness he worshipped wasn't her truth, it was her tactic. There's a moment every man remembers, not the breakup, not the argument, but the moment he gave his power away and didn't even notice. For Ethan, it was the night he apologized for something he didn't do. She had gotten distant again. Short replies, cold eyes. He asked gently if something was wrong. She said, "You're just exhausting sometimes." And he believed her, not because it was true, but because the fear of losing her was stronger than the truth of himself. So he said sorry. And in that one word, he handed over a piece of himself. Not as a gesture of maturity, not as a bridge to connection, but as a sacrifice to stay loved. That's how it starts. Little trades, little surrenders, each one dressed in the costume of compromise. But underneath, it's not mutual, it's not fair, it's not love, it's dependency. He remembered another time. He skipped a trip with friends because she said she felt insecure about him being away. He thought he was choosing love, but he was choosing silence, choosing to avoid the discomfort of her withdrawal. Because when someone makes their affection conditional, every act of honesty feels like a risk, and every risk feels like losing the only thing keeping you whole. Ethan had become fluent in emotional surrender, and the more fluent he got, the less language he had to speak for himself. He stopped saying, "I don't like that," stopped asking, "What about me?" He learned to read her moods before she spoke, to adjust his tone, to filter his truth, to prioritize her peace over his own. And she didn't demand it, she didn't have to, because he had already trained himself to believe that love required vanishing. Have you ever done that, sat in a room with someone who says they love you, but you feel invisible? That's not connection, that's captivity. And what's worse, you built the cage yourself. You called it devotion, you called it growth, but all it did was shrink you. And one day, like Ethan, you look around and realize you gave her everything except your boundaries, and without boundaries, you're not in love, you're in submission. The hard truth: she didn't take control, you gave it away, not out of weakness, but out of fear. The fear that if you ever stood your ground, she might walk away. But here's what Ethan's learning now. The love that leaves when you stand tall was never meant to stay. So now he breathes deeper. Not because he's over it, but because he's remembering that his voice matters, that his needs are not burdens, that his truth is not negotiable. And for the first time in years, he doesn't need permission to be himself, just stillness. And the courage to stay there. She didn't change. That's what Ethan kept telling himself, until the voice got tired of lying. Because deep down, he knew she didn't transform overnight. She didn't suddenly become distant, cold, indifferent. She just stopped pretending. In the beginning, everything felt effortless. The way she touched his arm when she laughed, the long texts filled with warmth and emojis, the late-night calls where she whispered, "I feel safe with you." But slowly, the warmth dimmed. The messages got shorter, the silence got longer, and her eyes, they stopped lingering. Ethan thought he had done something wrong. Maybe he was too emotional. Maybe he loved too hard. Maybe he didn't try hard enough. But none of that was true. Because the truth was brutal in its simplicity. She gave him what he needed for as long as it served her. And once it didn't, once his attention no longer felt like power, she withdrew, not out of cruelty, not even out of malice, out of calculation. Because for some people, affection is currency. And once the exchange is no longer profitable, they close the account. Ethan remembered the exact moment it shifted. They were watching a movie. He reached for her hand like he always did. And instead of warmth, she moved it gently away, like brushing off lint. No words, no explanation, just distance. And it was in that moment he felt something collapse inside, not because she rejected him, but because he realized she never truly embraced him. She welcomed his affection, accepted his devotion, used his energy as emotional insulation. But when he stopped entertaining, when he started needing instead of giving, her interest vanished. It wasn't that she changed, it's that she finished the performance. Because the woman who showed up in the beginning wasn't the whole truth. She was a role, one designed to attract, to secure, to stabilize, but not to stay. Ethan wasn't in a relationship with a person. He was in a relationship with a version sculpted from his needs, his wounds, his hopes. And when that version no longer aligned with her gains, she let it die. She didn't announce it. She didn't owe him closure. She just stopped feeding the illusion. And that's what broke him, not her leaving, but realizing she had been leaving long before she walked out the door. Have you ever felt that? Like someone slowly unplugged from your soul and you didn't even hear the click. He kept asking himself, what did I miss? But the better question was, what did I refuse to see? Because sometimes the person who breaks you the most isn't the one who lied. It's the one who simply stopped pretending. Ethan sat in the quiet of his apartment, weeks after she left, staring at the chair she used to curl up in. The same chair where she'd sip her tea, laugh softly, toss him glances that felt like permission to exist. And suddenly, it hit him. He didn't miss her. He missed the way he felt around her, the way her approval made him feel alive, the way her affection made the world seem manageable, the way her presence numbed the ache he never wanted to face alone. He whispered to himself, I didn't love her, I loved the feeling she gave me. And there it was, the truth he had danced around, the truth he feared more than heartbreak. Because that kind of love, if you can call it that, wasn't about her at all. It was about escape. She was never his partner, she was his distraction from the emptiness, from the fear, from the question he kept burying deep. Am I enough on my own? And when she was there, it was easy to say yes. Because her touch became evidence, her laugh became proof, her love became the drug. But what happens when the drug wears off, when the high fades and you're left alone with yourself? Ethan realized he had never seen her clearly. He had projected, idealized, constructed a fantasy version of her, made of hope and hunger. She wasn't the answer, she was the amplifier of everything he was avoiding. And the worst part, she never lied to him, he lied to himself, told himself she was his peace, his purpose, his reward, but the truth, she was a mirror. And when that mirror stopped showing him the man he wanted to be, he called it loss. But it wasn't loss, it was exposure. Have you ever been there? Thinking you're grieving someone, when really you're grieving the version of yourself that only existed around them. That version, polished, adored, validated, felt like your real self. But it wasn't. It was a costume stitched together by approval. And now that it's gone, you're not falling apart. You're falling into reality. Ethan doesn't hate her. He doesn't blame her. He thanks her. Because through the unraveling, he saw what he couldn't before. That he was never really in love with her. He was in love with the feeling of being needed. But love isn't dependency. And affection isn't validation. Real love begins when you no longer need a mirror to feel whole. She wasn't the fire, she was the match. And maybe now, he's finally ready to become the flame. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no thunder, no dramatic sunrise, no epiphany with music swelling in the background. Just a quiet morning. Ethan made coffee, sat by the window. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't reach for his phone, he didn't check for messages that weren't coming, didn't scroll for distractions, didn't replay memories, he just sat, breathing. It felt unfamiliar, almost wrong, but also real, and that's when it started, not healing, not victory, but return. A return to himself, not the self shaped by her love, but the one that existed before he believed he had to earn love at all. He started rebuilding, not with loud affirmations or forced confidence, but with tiny acts of truth. He said no to things that didn't feel right. He stopped apologizing for wanting space. He let silence be okay. He journaled not to impress, not to share, just to hear his own voice again. He listened to music she never liked. He wore that old cologne without flinching. And every time he did something for himself, without asking, would she approve? He reclaimed a piece of his power. This wasn't about becoming cold or detached or bitter. It was about becoming whole. Because Ethan had lived for too long as a man measured by someone else's gaze. Now he was learning to look in the mirror and not flinch, to say, "This is who I am," without needing applause, to feel joy without permission, to feel anger without shame, to feel alone without fear. That's what it means to choose yourself, not in arrogance, not in revenge, but in remembrance that you were never supposed to be completed by someone else. You were supposed to come home to you. If you're here listening, if something in your chest feels like it's waking up, don't ignore it. That's your soul asking to be chosen. And this time, not by her, but by you. She was different. The woman Ethan met months later didn't feel like a rescue. She didn't arrive in a whirlwind or say all the perfect things. She didn't study his wounds, didn't try to reflect his hunger back to him. She was just present. And for the first time, so was he. He didn't try to impress, didn't hide his edges, didn't bend his truth into something palatable. He showed up as himself. And something strange happened. He didn't crave her validation. He appreciated her company, yes. But he didn't need it to feel like a man. She didn't fill a void, because there was no longer a void to fill. That's when he knew he wasn't chasing illusions anymore. The story he once lived by, the one where love was earned, where he had to disappear to be desired, that story had burned. And in the ashes he found freedom, not from women, not from love, but from the lie that he had to be less of himself to be worthy of either. He still felt fear sometimes, still missed the comfort of old patterns. But now when those voices whispered, "You're not enough," he didn't beg someone else to silence them. He stood in the silence and answered for himself, not with bravado, not with performance, just presence. That was the shift. That was the awakening. Because love, real love, doesn't begin with another person seeing you. It begins when you finally see yourself clearly, fully, without disguise. And only then can someone else meet you in that truth, not as a mirror, not as a savior, but as a witness. So if you're here, if you've listened all the way through, maybe you're ready to stop performing, ready to stop chasing, ready to stop waiting for someone else to choose you so you can finally feel like enough. Because the version of you that depended on her to feel whole, that version wasn't the truth. The truth is, you are not broken. You are not missing pieces. You are not someone waiting to be completed. You are already here. Whole, grounded, rising, and the love you deserve, the love that lasts, won't come from losing yourself. It will come from being yourself loudly, honestly, unapologetically. So take this moment, breathe into it, let it settle deep. Because the illusion is gone, and what's left is you. Welcome back.